What's up, and welcome back to the Watchmen Companion Podcast presented by The Disorderly. Please head over to thedisorderly.com for the best in sports and entertainment. This week, Season 1, Episode 3, She Was Killed by Space Junk. Another great one, in my opinion. And by the way, I know I said I'd get into the PDpedia stuff in a late week episode, but I didn't, so I apologize for that. Sorry about the confusion. It basically feels like homework, honestly, and I read through it. A lot of it is sort of reiterated in the show. Like, they added a lot of context about the Tulsa riots, and then it was kind of explained to us in the next episode. So I don't know how worth it is to go super deep diving into that. There is some interesting stuff. It does do some good world building. Possibly later in this companion podcast run, I might get deeper into it, but I probably won't lean too much on it because it does just kind of seem like extra. And don't get me wrong, I love extra content, especially when it's Lindelof and a show I care about, but I didn't think it was really worth it once I got, deep into it. But getting to this episode, we open with a woman entering a satellite phone booth that can send messages to Dr. Manhattan on Mars. Theoretically, anyway. Who knows if these things actually work or if they're just sort of a fake sort of gimmick. Either way, the woman tells a long joke that's segmented throughout the episode. So for simplicity reasons, I'll just kind of tell it in order at the end. But let's just say it starts with a girl throwing a brick into the sky. Now, a little extra detail here. The phone booth is owned and operated by True, which is the company that bought Adrian Veidt's company, and we still don't know much else about True. But it's something that is not in the comics, something that's been kind of a recurring thing that keeps coming up in this show, so there's a very good chance that it'll play a major part in the conclusion of the show, in the plot development, all this stuff. Otherwise, why introduce them at all? And the fact that they've just sort of been hinted at and teased around, but we've never even met, Lady True, the person who runs this company. We don't know who she is. We don't know really much about anything other than the fact that she bought Adrian Veidt's company, but this is episode 3. They keep teasing it, so I would assume there's going to be some reveal. Could be next episode, could be later in the season. Who knows? But again, why introduce them at all if they're not going to play a major role? Now, on to the next scene, we see the woman, who I guess we might as well reveal now is Laurie Blake, even though it isn't said at this point in the episode. But we see her robbing a bank. Turns out it's a sting operation to catch mass vigilantes, and everyone in the bank is in on it. They're all feds. They all work for the FBI. The guy runs. Laurie shoots him in the back. Now, at this point, you can see the man behind the counter looking genuinely disturbed, despite being a fellow FBI agent. And you can also see the look on Laurie's face that she is genuinely angry as she does it. Now, if you ever read the comics or seen the movies, you already know that Laurie Blake is Silk Spectre, a former member of the Watchmen. She actually went by Laurie Jupiter, but finds out over the course of the story that her real father is Edward Blake, a.k.a. the comedian, who we're yet to see in this show. I don't know if he's even really been talked about, but let's just say that the comedian's a complicated character. That's putting it lightly. He's not exactly a 100% good guy. Despite being a mass vigilante, despite being one of only 2 mass vigilantes that were employed by the government after the Keene Act. So given everything, given all the hardship that Laurie has experienced in the comics and then beyond, coupled with the reveal that her dad is Edward Blake, well, shit, I guess everyone would be a little jaded about the whole superhero thing, right? That makes sense. And Laurie is clearly dealing with some stuff. I mean, that's obvious. You can see it in the grimace on her face as she shoots the mass vigilante. What's his name? Shadow? Mr. Shadow or whatever? I forget what they said his name was, but yeah. Now, the public is split on the whole illegal vigilante thing, which is to be expected. See any superhero movie, it's the same thing. He's a hero. He's a danger to society. He's keeping the streets safe. He's operating above the law. Can't be trusted. There's a bunch of angles to this thing, which is really what makes the genre so appealing in the first place. But I did like the touch at the end of the scene when Laurie says that the guy is not a hero. He's a joke. First of all, obviously, it's a subtle nod to the comedian, as the whole running joke throughout the entire episode is as well. But it also shows her disdain for those imposters, so to speak. To Laurie, the Watchmen, the Minutemen before them, those were real superheroes. Those were real crime fighters dealing with not bank robberies, but things that threatened, the future of the human race and all this stuff. And these other guys dressing up and stopping bank robberies and things like that, those are kind of just a joke to her. So it turns out Laurie has a relationship with Joseph Keene Jr. as well. Not that kind of relationship, although who knows, I guess. But we know they know each other because he shows up at her door to tell her that she's going to be relocated to Tulsa. And it also seems like it's kind of a complicated relationship. So as a reminder, the Keene Act, put in place by Joseph Keene, Joe Jr.'s father, made mass vigilante work illegal unless it was commissioned by the federal government. Laurie apparently joined the FBI and went that route, but her love interest from the comics, a man named Daniel Dreiberg, a.k.a. Night Owl, or Night Owl 2, technically, named after the original member of the Minutemen. We don't need to get too bogged down in the comic book lore, but basically this guy named Night Owl that Laurie from the comics had a thing with, he decided apparently to continue operating in the shadows illegally. Well, we find out that Night Owl has been arrested since the ending of the comics, which is interesting because they were both breaking the law in the comics. They were both operating above the law in the comics, right? So I don't know. It's interesting that she somehow became a Fed and he got arrested. I wonder how that all played out. I'm sure we'll get more context on that. But as of now, we're not really sure how or when that happened. Could have been 2 days ago. Could have been, right after the comics. I don't know. But this information is revealed in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way when Joe says that when he becomes president, he can pardon anyone he wants. He could even, quote, get your owl out of that cage. Now, there is literally an owl in a cage in Laurie's room, an owl named Who, which is another little joke. But to comic book fans, this is very clearly referring to the night owl. So Laurie thinks that if she takes point on this police slaying issue in Tulsa and does a good job with it, perhaps Joe Keane will become president after all, and he could free Daniel Dreiberg from whatever sort of prison he's in. So next we have the FBI briefing and the introduction of Agent Petey from the aforementioned Peteypedia, sort of gung-ho, ambitious young FBI agent with a particular interest in the history of mass vigilantes. We first meet him as he's operating the slide projector, and he slips a little segment of Rorschach's journal into the presentation, much to the chagrin of the man giving the presentation, who basically says, who gives a shit about Rorschach? This isn't the 1980s. But anyway, I just for clarification, I paused it to take a look at which journal entries were included. The first one kind of talks about the fall of the city, pretty standard Rorschach stuff. The second gets into his meeting and first impressions of Adrian Veidt. He basically says that he's pampered and decadent, speculates whether he's a homosexual. Not sure there's much there other than, showing some of Rorschach's more bigoted opinions, which he did have. That obviously could have been perverted to fit the motives of the 7th Cavalry who wear his mask. I don't know why else that would be in there, or if we're even meant to pause it and look that deep into it. I assume that Lindelof knows people will do that when you put something like that on screen, even though it's way too fast to read in real time. But I don't know. I don't know how much is there. Regardless, the entire federal force is basically going to come out to Tulsa, and Laurie insists that it's just her. The guy who's giving the presentation says, you can't go alone, and she says, fine, I'll take him, referring to Agent Petey. So Petey is going with, oh, by the way, I should say this. My dog's name is Petey, P-E-D-E-Y, named after Dustin Pedroia. His nickname is Petey. Every time I say his name when I'm doing this podcast, he like lifts his head and kind of crooks his neck and wondering what's going on. But yeah, sorry, buddy. Go to sleep. All right. Yeah. So as soon as Laurie and Petey touch down in Tulsa, she heads to the underground interrogation warehouse where she sees all the chaos that's going on in the wake of the police chief slaying all the people they rounded up from Dixonville. She's in search of Looking Glass, but she meets up with Pirate Jenny and Red Scare first. Now, I love how she sort of pokes fun at the whole superhero thing throughout all of this. Like, it's not normalized at all when it comes to her. Again, with her being a former member of the Watchmen, that makes sense that she would have that sort of approach to it. But these are essentially imposters playing pretend. They're playing dress up. They're acting like superheroes. They have no powers. There's nothing else to make them act that way other than the fact that it's kind of cool to dress up in a mask and play pretend and play like badass crime fighter. You know what I mean? So when she asked the two officers for their names and they say Pirate Jenny and Red Scare, and she's just like, wow, cool. It's a very funny response. It makes it seem so ridiculous, which it is. Like, it's a Russian guy dressed up in a red mask called Red Scare. And Pirate Jenny, I mean, I don't know, man. But it is funny because we're watching a show and you can get lost in the minutia of it and being like, oh, yeah, it's a superhero show. It makes sense. But if these people existed in the real world, there'd be a lot of people who would be like, wow, that's pretty, it's pretty corny. I don't know how else to put it, really. So I like that she's sort of adding that element to it. And by the way, for whatever it's worth, when Petey and Laurie are flying over to Tulsa, they look out the window and they get a peek at something called the Millennium Clock, which was built by Lady True. Now, she went on to quote Ozymandias apparently as a tribute to Adrian Veidt during the groundbreaking by saying, look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Not really much else on that, the whole Millennium Clock thing, but once again, why would they introduce that if that's not going to play a factor in some way? And we all know the Watchmen and the connection between clocks. There's multiple times where you hear that ticking noise superimposed over everything else in this episode as well. So clearly there's a theme there. Clearly the Millennium Clock will probably come into play in some way in the future episodes. Anyway, she finds Looking Glass, talks to him in the interrogation room. By the way, how about the double meaning of Looking Glass's words when he literally says, can I have the control back, please? Referring to the remote control, but also showing his lack of control in that situation. Laurie gives it to him, but she's very clearly still in control. She has him basically take his mask off because she knows who he is. And then, of course, Looking Glass's reaction when Laurie reveals that she also knows who Sister Knight's true identity is. You can almost see in his face how much it pains him to have them unmasked like that. Based on the events of the White Knight, I assume. That's probably where this is coming from. But these masks are also sort of masks for their fears and emotions. Like, for example, when Looking Glass said he was crying under his mask in the last episode, after the chief died. So I did like how they keep tying that in, and they're showing that the mask is as symbolic as it is physical. You know what I mean? Well, next thing we know, we're at the funeral for Judd Crawford, and things do not go well. First, Laurie attempts to set up a meeting with Angela, and she gets rejected. That meeting would come later, as both characters find themselves in a mausoleum, but more on that when we get there. Before any of that, we saw a member of the 7th Cavalry sneaking through an underground tunnel into a hole in that same mausoleum. He's armed with a suicide vest. He says that he wants Joaquin Jr. to go with him and threatens that if his heart stops beating, the bomb will go off. Laurie ignores this, shoots the guy in the head, kind of paralleling what she did with the mass vigilante in the bank. She's kind of just recklessly shooting, but this time it kind of catches up with her because the bomb actually goes off. Now, it's revealed in that later conversation that Laurie thought the threat was a fake. However, Joe was going to go with him. Was this an inside job to further throw the suspicion off Joe, or was this a real attack? I don't know. But I do know that nobody expected Laurie to shoot him because everyone was supposed to have their weapons stripped heading into the funeral. Right? It's also revealed in that later conversation that the FBI was planning on exhuming Judd's body to look for more clues. However, this is no longer an option because his body exploded. Right? Angela dragged, I guess, the suicide bomber into the open grave, pushed Judd's casket on top of it, and the suicide bomber blew up, therefore blowing up Judd Crawford. But the whole point of that conversation was that Laurie also discovered the secret compartment in Judd's closet, only all she found was a naked bust and no Klansman robe. She accuses Angela of disposing of whatever was on that bust, which, she probably did. She was the last person in the room. We didn't actually see her do it. We don't know the answer to that question yet, but I'm assuming that's probably exactly what happened. Now, let's get to that joke that ran throughout this entire episode because it runs right up to the closing credits of the episode. I'm sure there are interpretations online. If you want to look them up, by all means, go ahead. But I haven't, just for context here, I haven't looked up anything, so this is purely my take on the meaning, unblemished by anyone else's. So I just wanted to do that. Let's get to it. It starts with a little girl and her father. Her father is a bricklayer. He always plans everything out perfectly. They go to build a barbecue in the backyard, and everything is perfect except that there's one brick left over. The father starts to freak out because there must be something wrong with the construction. After all, everything was planned out perfectly going into it. The little girl says she has an idea, and she throws the brick into the air. Then Laurie says she messed up the joke and starts a new one. The second joke goes like this. 3 heroes show up at the pearly gates awaiting judgment from God, and the first is dressed up like an owl. Obviously, at least to me, Night Owl. When God asks how many people he's killed in his quest for justice, Night Owl replies, none. God basically says that he's too soft and sends the hero to hell. The next hero is Ozymandias. He gloats about 3 million people he's killed in an effort to save humanity. God calls him a monster, sends him to hell. The hero goes to hell again. The third hero is obviously Dr. Manhattan. She says hero number 3 is basically a god himself, and when asked what he did with all his gifts, he said he fell in love with a woman, walked across the sun, fell in love with another woman, won the Vietnam War, and stopped giving a shit about humanity. Now, the first woman was Jenny Slater, who he met before he became Dr. Manhattan, and kind of during they were together. That's actually how he became Dr. Manhattan. He was, fixing a watch or whatever. And the second is Laurie, the one making the phone call. Anyway, the blue guy says that he already knows God's going to send him to hell because he's already in hell, and so he does. He snaps his fingers, and the hero goes to hell. And the final part of the joke is about a woman who is standing behind the heroes the whole time. She tells God that she doesn't have any special talents of note, and God says, I'm sorry this never happens, but I don't know who you are. She says, I'm the little girl who threw the brick in the air, and suddenly a brick comes out of nowhere, hits God in the head, killing him and sending God to hell. Now, don't get me wrong. I will definitely look up other people's interpretations of this joke as soon as I, put this podcast out. But here's what I think. The little girl is obviously Laurie. She is the sort of the forgotten hero. The other heroes, Night Owl, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, they've all been done away with, but everyone's kind of forgot about the Silk Spectre. Now, I'm assuming God in this scenario isn't actually God, but it's some sort of power figure, possibly Joaquin Jr., possibly whoever's pulling the strings of Joaquin Jr. Maybe it's about some sort of supervillain, which could be one and the same, who is yet to be revealed. I don't know. Possibly Lady True could be that character. Now, if the little girl is Laurie, her father, the bricklayer, would be the comedian. So the comedian could freak out because things aren't going perfectly. There's something left over. Turns out that it's not really an extra. It's not something left over. It's a brick a weapon that could be used in the dismantling of this godlike figure who keeps sending all the heroes to hell. The episode ends with Lori completing the phone call and then almost getting a car dropped on her from space, the same car that got airlifted at the end of the last episode. Also kind of a funny tie-in with the brick that got, thrown into the heavens and dropped from the sky onto God and killed God. The car, obviously, at the end of the last episode was lifted into the heavens and then fell, almost killing her. And also the name of the episode was She Was Killed by Space Junk, so it all sort of ties in with that as well. But we can't wrap up this episode without getting into the Ozymandias stuff because he's still doing his own thing and God knows where. The plot is seemingly completely separate, although it will come and tie in, as the series goes. But we did get some more info on all of that stuff, but much of it's still shrouded in mystery, let's be honest. He confirmed that he is Adrian Veidt, a.k.a. Ozymandias. We also know that he's imprisoned on his land with certain rules in place, like he can't maybe kill the livestock or can't take the livestock that he's killed, and seemingly can't leave a certain radius from his home. My guess is that that's what the suit's for. Like, he's trying to figure out a suit that makes it so he can wander around, and he's using these Mr. Phillips clones as a sort of guinea pig process to try this out. Well, the clone in this episode freezes to death, so obviously the suit is not suitable, for lack of a better term. But also, Ozymandias is able to stand right in the same spot where the guy froze to death. So maybe this is something that happens at night. Maybe the temperature of this place drops to extreme lows, like some sort of crazy extreme desert type climate, and that's what prevents him from wandering too far from home. I'm not really sure. For all we know, this could be on Mars, right? This whole thing could be on Mars. It could be some sort of prison set up by Dr. Manhattan for his crimes against humanity, although he doesn't give a shit about humanity. Maybe he does. I don't really know. So much of this plotline is still a huge mystery. And I have a feeling that the overall reception of this show will come down to how well this storyline is tied into everything else. So, no pressure. Anyway, it's all being enforced by someone called the Game Warden, who has a skull and crossbone as a symbol. There's a flag planted on the ground with skull and crossbones, and it was also the seal used for the letter. Oh, and I guess Adrian Veidt's giving the Game Warden some of those tomatoes from the tomato tree for whatever reason. But that's it for this week. Thank you for listening, guys. I appreciate the time. I hope you rate, review, subscribe to the Disorderly Podcast. We'll be putting every Disorderly thing out on this podcast stream. Go to thedisorderly.com for the best in sports and entertainment. I think the plan is to merge MMA Mad onto the Disorderly platform at some point. So if you guys are MMA fans, fight fans, I've been doing that podcast for, 5-6 years now, interviewing all the best fighters, writers, and coaches in the world of MMA. So if you're interested in that, those will be coming to the Disorderly. And I think that's it. I think that's going to be it for this week. So I will see you guys next week. Obviously, a complicated show. I appreciate you joining me and helping me understand it better. If you have any feedback, please leave your comments on the YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. You can reach me on Twitter at Nick Rizner, NickRizner. DMs are open if you want to ask any questions, comments, criticisms about this podcast. All are welcome. Oh, and quick before I go, obviously the HBO official Watchmen podcast was launched I believe this week. I don't know if there was an episode before this, but this is the first time I've ever seen it really advertised. It was actually on the HBO Go platform. It was like Watchmen, scroll over one, Watchmen podcast. Now, I didn't listen to it. I didn't have a chance to. I don't like to listen to other podcasts before I do my own, only because I don't want it to sort of bleed into my brain and all of a sudden I'm regurgitating theories and sort of things that I've heard in other podcasts rather than things that I've sort of discovered just from watching the show. So that goes with really the only podcast I listen to consistently with all these TV shows is the Bald Move podcast. I just like what Jim and Aaron bring to the table with all that, but I don't even listen to their show. I'll listen to their instant take, and I won't listen to their full podcast until I release mine. That's just how I do it. So I also haven't listened to this HBO one. It's not a knock on that show. I probably will listen to it. I did click on it quick, though, and it's just an audio podcast on the HBO platform. Why not at the very least? Because this is something that us other podcasts, we don't have access to the materials. We can't actually use clips from the show or any of that because it's not, licensed. You just can't do that. So when I release a podcast, it's going to be audio. That's all it's going to be. You're not going to have clips from the show. But it being an official HBO show, unless it gets into it further in, I could be ranting about nothing. But from what I saw, it's literally just a screenshot, just like we do, of the logo of their podcast, and then just audio over it. Now, they had Damon Lindelof as a guest, which is awesome, and I'm going to look forward to that interview to see his thoughts on the show. I'm a huge fan of his. It just seems like if you have the HBO resources and you're going to make a podcast that's supposed to, be different than all these other podcasts like this one where we're breaking down and discussing what we're seeing on screen, why would you not incorporate some of those resources and show clips? And when you're talking about a specific scene from the show, throw it to that clip. Now, again, maybe they do. I watched the first 30 seconds of it, but if they don't, I feel like that's a wasted opportunity. But yeah, that's where I'll leave you this week. So I hope you guys will tune in next week. I hope you enjoy your weekend. I'll be here next week with more discussion about the Watchmen, episode 4, obviously upcoming. And yeah, man, great show so far. So thank you guys for joining me. I'll see you next week. Peace.